All right. I think the idea here is we'd love to have fun, and figure making can be time consuming, frustrating, intimidating. We've heard uses words used like that. And it should be fun. We hope that using BioRender is easy, and we've got templates and icons that give you a really nice jumping off point, so you don't have to make figures from scratch, which can be very intimidating. Um, so yeah, let's have fun. Let's keep it interactive, and feel free to ask away questions throughout the webinar if you have them. I'm going to keep the poll running just for a little longer as people trickle in so that we can catch a few more votes there. But please answer the questions if you can. A little bit about myself. So my name is Shiz. I am one of the co-founders of BioRender. My past life, I was a medical illustrator. So I'm dating myself here, but studied about 15 years ago at Hopkins, and since then have been building out my my career and passion really in the visual science communication space, very hyper-focused in that area. So I'm super proud to be working with the incredible team at BioRender right now. Um, Shameless plug here, we have this neat new spell check feature. So I've just added my name to my dictionary so it doesn't suggest a spelling error. And that's actually nice because sometimes, we're very scrutinizing with our spelling mistakes in text form, but sometimes not in figures. So we've built that in recently. Awesome. Okay. There's probably a million tips we could have shared with you today, but what we're going to do is consolidate it into really 4 key elements. And today's topic is obviously around grant figures. So luckily, if you take away these 4 tips and apply it in your day-to-day figure making, you'll actually improve across the board for any other grant, any other figure type, not just grants. Grants specifically, there are some certain restrictions and guidelines, which I'll try to sort of sprinkle in as we go. But luckily, again, these tips are pretty ubiquitous. So hopefully you'll learn a thing or two about figure making in general. And BioRender team, just let me know if my audio cuts out or the video cuts out at all, and I'll adjust accordingly. All right. So the 4 things are clarity over beauty. I will go into, examples of that. But we're really optimizing for communication and not just a pretty figure. It would be, detrimental to just optimize for something that is beautiful. In fact, clarity, there is beauty in clarity, so it's not like they're opposing forces. But let's aim for clarity in the sense of the word. And then color is a powerful tool that is often abused. So we'll talk a little bit about how to use it to your advantage and not let it, break your figure, because it really can make or break an image. I see some thumbs up of agreement there. Arrows are also a special thing that are seemingly innocuous or innocent, but they actually can also make or break your figure. And we also don't put much thought into it. We slap it in at the very last minute, thinking that the more arrows, the better to direct the eye, and that's not the case. And then context. Know your audience if you can, and know the final format or output in which you're making your figure for. Don't just slap in your publication figure into your grant, or your grant figure into your presentation or your thesis or your poster. There's a little bit of tweaking that you have to do for specific purposes. Okay, so those are the 4 main things. And I would say we didn't just pull these out of thin air. They're really the things that we find as being the most common mistakes in figure making today, particularly with grant figures. And full disclosure, this is my background, but I have never applied for an NIH grant or a major grant like that before. I've contributed to figures for them. I don't envy the pressure that you have. Again, these tips and learnings that we've accumulated over, helping hundreds and hundreds of scientists create figures for their grants will help you. All right, so let's dive in. We're going to cover 4 tips, sort of like a bit of a design crash course, and then we're going to do some live figure makeovers together, because sometimes you have to just watch and see and repeat um, theory into practice. I hate going to webinars and they just talk theory at me and then I leave not really understanding how to apply them. So we'll try to make sure that we dedicate half of this time to actually applying the theory. Okay, clarity over beauty. What comes to mind for me is, I know this seems silly, but IKEA. IKEA is like, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I don't know. I'm sure there's case studies around this, but they are trailblazers in sort of universal, approachable design. If you look at this is the famous Billy bookcase. I'm sure you've all put one together before in our lifetime. Um, but it's so beautiful because it is so complicated. What they're communicating is basically how to assemble a piece of furniture on a single sheet. So they're limited by paper because they don't want to print 3 sheets. That's 3 times expensive than 1 sheet per object or per product. It's black and white, so it saves on color. But actually, in doing so, it's more clear. The lack of color makes it more clear. Isn't that crazy? We think that we just add color and it and adds to it. It actually detracts because color is so hard to do well. Also, talking about arrows, if you look carefully, there's actually no arrows in this diagram whatsoever, except in very specific areas where they're trying to tell us to, like, spin the screwdriver or slide in this backing here. I don't know if you can see, I'll just zoom into my BioRender file. See the limited number of arrows? It reminds me so much of a successful science figure. Not only that, and by the way, I'm panning in BioRender using the space bar and then clicking with my mouse and dragging if you ever want to pan around your BioRender figure. I've also collapsed the library to the side, so if it looks a little different than what you're used to, that's why. Not a lot of people know you can collapse the menu, so you have more space to work with. Also, when you have, certain grant figures require like a little legend, like this cell means this, or this symbol means this. They've got their really nicely laid out legend. And, the lack of words, which is crazy. There's literally no words in here except the name of the product. It really makes it language agnostic. So I think the TLDR, or the short end of it, or the summary, is really let's aim to be like an IKEA instruction manual. I know it sounds silly, but there's so much creative invention happening. Even these call outs, when you're looking at microscopes and you can't see what's happening at a microscopic level, these little call outs, they've done so well. Just like little call outs here that zoom into certain areas without losing context. They still have that, the whole bookshelf there, so you kind of know where they're pointing to. Okay, I can speak on and on about this. In fact, I did a little fun exercise and threw some colors in Photoshop. Sorry for the absurd color. And I know this looks exaggerated, but this is what we see very often with science figures, is just sort of random placement of color where it really detracts from the story. Sometimes we have unnecessary background color. And, if we were to add color, maybe we could have replaced where the gray areas are into like the typical brown color, that medium density fiber that they use. That might be the only important place to put it, but really the gray does the job. So I know it sounds boring, but when in doubt, don't use color. All right. Another example was an illustration that I was fortunate to work on while at Hopkins. And you can see the inspiration of IKEA in my surgical illustrations. Is if this had color in it, it would have detracted from an already complicated image. This image is talking about how if you have damage to the tendon for your thumb, you can actually use one of the 2 tendons of your index finger, reroute it, and then have a functioning thumb again. That's in a nutshell what we're trying to show here. I think the one successful part of this was just like the zoom into like this weave technique. But now looking at it, this was now, I'm going to date myself again, like 13 years ago. What I really should have done is something like this, talking about clarity over beauty. This is, now looking at this, sadly, way more clear than what I've shown here, which, has nice textures and such. Sometimes it's required as like a little call out on the side. When I was working at National Geographic, we had a lot of beautifully illustrated sort of mammals and dissections. And then in the corner, we'd have like a little simple call out of what the summary of the story is. And sometimes that's what's, needed, is just a simple schematic of a more complicated diagram. So I think this would have added a lot to the figure now looking back at it, but just wanted to illustrate, think of how much more clear this is than sort of what I've shown at the beginning here. Yeah, clarity over beauty sometimes. Okay, next topic, color. And I'm going to power through the next few slides so we can get to the figure makeover. If you're just joining, we're going through a bit of a design crash course, and then we're going to go into real examples that a lot of you have submitted. And the design team and I actually went through all week and did a bit of a figure makeover for them. So we're going to show you the before and after and how we made each figure better. So thank you to everybody who volunteered bravely. They were beautiful, beautiful figures to begin with. Okay, we covered clarity over beauty. Color, powerful tool. Here's an example. I'm probably like blowing out your retinas here, but an example of misuse of color. I would say one thing that I immediately do when I see diagrams like this is to really subdue the saturation. And that's really easy. Of course, using BioRender here, we have a saturation slider. Now, black and white, it's a little boring, I admit. So sometimes adding a little bit of color is nice, but desaturated as much as possible. So something like this shade, you'd be surprised how dull of a color you can get away with. And maybe if the point of your story is that this dendritic cell is the most important player in this process, then maybe that's where you add the saturation of color, that pop of color. Otherwise, color is, again, a powerful tool. But if you highlight everything, then you've highlighted nothing because it's just too overwhelming. So take this as an example. If the dendritic cell was the most important piece, let's highlight that, maybe even give it a glow. And immediately, ignoring the left here, on the right side, everything, they have their own identity, but they're not standing out or yelling at me for attention. And that's the important thing to keep in mind here is, oh, this is really cool, by the way. You can overlay any color in BioRender on icons. This might be actually only on the premium version, but I'll show you at the end of this webinar how you can get free access to the premium version, even if it's through a free trial. But yeah, this is how you'd play around with color. Use it to your advantage. Don't let it overtake your figure. To take this a step further, and this is an important thing to keep in mind through every type of figure you make, is that color represents certain concepts like antagonist or protagonist, the villain versus the hero of your story. Every science story, I believe, I haven't come across ones that really disprove this, but you can prove me wrong. There's something around a villain and a protagonist. In some cases, if it's an autoimmune disease, your immune system is the villain. In some cases, the cancer cell is the villain. Sometimes both of them are villains in your story, but it's really important to communicate who you're identifying as the villain. I guess the takeaway here is that cool colors tend to denote or communicate protagonists or heroes of the story. Hospital walls are blue, they're soothing. Red denotes inflammation or danger. And so we really want to make sure that those color concepts are carried through in your diagram. I know it seems frivolous, but it actually says so much without really any text. Without saying anything, you say so much. So if you look at the left, the cancer cell in my brain tells me that it's the villain. On the right, it actually kind of looks like the lymphocytes are all or the white blood cells are all villains of the story. Do you see the difference there? Um, and I have a few other examples in the images that you've submitted that show this a little more. Okay, so cool colors, protagonists or heroes, warm colors like reds and oranges, preserve those for villains of the story, or maybe just like the highlight of your story. The most important part of your story is like the brightest, most saturated object. Here's an example also where color can come back to bite you. That is that it's very deceiving. Yes, we have a beautifully colored purple DNA on top of this blue nucleus, which is two very different colors. But keep in mind, we've got a lot of colorblind folks in the audiences. Your grant reviewer might be colorblind. They might print your proposal. They might kill a bunch of trees. I've heard this. I went to a grant conference a couple years back, and there were hundreds of grant reviewers. And I went around and asked them, what's the most painful part about reviewing grants? A lot of it was clarity of communication. A lot of it, I was shocked. After the 100th grant they're reviewing, sadly, some of them stop reading the text. They jump to the figure. They determine whether can they communicate based on the image. Am I lost? Next. Really sad. And I've seen this before with people who read publications. It's you go to the graphical abstract first or the figures. I'm sure if you're sifting through hundreds of articles, you don't read the discussion section in detail. Anyway, not to scare you, this will hopefully help you. We've got templates in BioRender where you don't even have to think about illustrating. It's almost done. But, again, color is deceiving. Sorry, I'm on a bit of a tangent there. And color can, again, come back to bite you if this is viewed in black and white, as in it's printed in black and white. So we've included this little contrast checker in BioRender. It's this little sunset looking icon where it sort of like previews your canvas in grayscale. So you can see whether you've lost any detail. The second something disappears in black and white mode, that's telling you immediately to fix that because there is not enough contrast in that section. So if I go from color in a colored world to black and white, let's check all the places that disappear. I'm losing these little balls, these cytokines, whatever they are, these cells in the test tube, I can barely see those. The label's gone. One of the strands of the DNA here is gone. It looks like single-stranded. So go back, improve the contrast by making either the background or the foreground more extreme in lightness or darkness. For example, this cancer cell label, if that was white font, clearly more contrasty than the background. And in a black and white world, it stands out. So just a little trick here. This is not just like a fancy nice to have. As a science design group inside BioRender, we make the templates that show up in your template gallery. We use black and white mode all the time just to make sure we're including enough contrast. I would say this is probably top 1 or 2 mistakes I still see in journal figures, grant figures, science figures is just contrast. And it's so easy to avoid. Just slap a grayscale on it. If you're in Photoshop, there's a grayscale mode as well. But I can't stress this enough. Super, super important because color is deceiving. Okay. Another way color is deceiving is it can lead the eye and focus the eye where it's the highest saturation and highest contrast. So what do I mean by that? Here's an image that is sort of colored sort of haphazardly. By the way, the original image, I believe, was from Daisy Chung, who created a beautiful diagram for us, and we've uploaded it into our templates gallery. So I've mucked this up a little bit. The original was really beautifully colored. Look what happens when I really focus the color on just one area. Exact same image, but now the color and the contrast is focused in one area. Maybe this is the focus of my research, and I really want that to be highlighted. Or maybe it's more in the proteins inside the cell. See how the focus now goes intracellular? So you can really play with that by, I'm going to control select all of these. Maybe I'll make it more of a neutral color. And maybe the proteins inside the cell are more important. Look how immediately my eye focused into the nucleus. You can let the rest of the image just fade into the background. And so, if I read the image caption, I don't have to look around to see, oh, I wonder where the author is meant for me to look. It's very obvious based on the color. So a little bit of an advanced technique, but play around with that. I guess the takeaway here is sort of remove all the color if you can from your diagram, and then just add it back sparingly, like seasoning for food. Just add it in small amounts. Oh, I just wanted to probe actually on one of our templates that's published in our BioRender gallery. We don't always get it right. In fact, here's a mistake, I think, a design mistake we made, which is that red is sort of showing up in a lot of places here. The CAR cell on this CAR T cell, this BITE protein is how you pronounce it, and then these antibodies, they're all red. So I'm thinking, like, are they all related to each other? Is one more important than the other because they're all competing for my attention? If the CAR proteins in this diagram are the more important thing, I probably knock these antibodies back, maybe making it a blue. This protein, I would make it maybe a lighter color. And there, the CAR proteins really stand out. There might also be too many colors on here, so I'd go back and maybe subdue it a little bit, but yeah, always room for improvement. Here's the before, here's the after. That was very minor. Okay, so that was color, a powerful tool. Arrows, use it sparingly. Again, it can make or break a diagram. I'm not going to go into detail here, but we do have this really neat worksheet in BioRender called Arrows. If you want to look for it, just go to the BioRender templates gallery and search arrows, and this will pop up. It's basically trying to communicate that there are many ways to use lines and arrows properly. And only one of the examples is denoting movement. So this arrow here is showing something going from point A to point B, but there's a lot of other ways arrows can be used. It could be used to show cut lines, or an arrow is a line, a dotted line, a cut line, maybe a growing or shrinking of a tumor, labeling a diagram. We recommend using this like little elbow hinge with this dot at the end, because if it was an arrow, I'll show you what that will look like. It actually looks like something's either moving into the cell or the vesicles. Again, it sort of communicates movement. So if you're not communicating movement, try to stick with something like this, just a line with the arrow at the end. Or, like the little square brackets, that also kind of communicates that you're labeling something. And also the intensity and the thickness of an arrow can communicate volume, pressure, strength, the amount of blood going from the portal vein. Actually, this is the wrong way. With the food you eat, the blood going up from your intestines to your liver is much greater than the bile leaving the gallbladder. That all was said just by the thickness of the arrows. Okay, so lots of ways to use arrows. You can look up all those on your own. I think the takeaway here, without overwhelming you too much on how to use the right arrows, is just to use arrows sparingly. Again, think back to the IKEA drawing where there was literally arrows in only very sparing places. You can replace arrows with, numbers with a circle around it to show, step 1, step 2, step 3, instead of always showing the next arrow to go to the next stage. Here's an example of an image. We've used this before, so this will be a good repeat if you've seen this. But this was an image that was volunteered by one of you in a past webinar. And I love it because there's lots of great content here, all the right ingredients. It's just the reading order gets quite confusing with the sheer number of arrows in here. Not only that, the arrows are taking on different colors and thicknesses. Some are curved, some are dotted. And so if I take a marker here, this is just a nifty little plugin I use sometimes, is Annotate, is a Chrome extension. Hopefully we get this built into BioRender soon, the sort of like annotation tool. But anyway, I'm going to start my eye up here because I see a number 1, and as if I'm using an eye tracking tool, I'm going to kind of mimic what a grant reviewer might see when they're coming across your figure. Number 1, number 2, there's this other opposing force here that's telling me to look this way, but then I'm looking for number 3 because I was sort of on a mission to follow the numbers. There's a number 3 there, but then there's these really strong arrows pointing me back this way. There's another one here, and oh, here's that other arrow that came from number 2 back to this giant tumor, and I'm finally at 4. So look at the kind of like meandering that my eye had to do, and the now exhaustion that I'm probably feeling from trying to follow this image. And it probably could have been reduced. The strain could be reduced just by reducing the number of arrows. Let me see here. Let me go to the next slide. We literally took all the same elements, rotated it about 90 degrees, and stripped it of its arrows and replaced it with sort of a large arrow that kind of created this inertia or gravitational force around the image. If you can see that difference, there's the before and there's the after. It took a little bit of puzzle piecing and Tetrising, but that's a lot of design, is just sort of taking elements that already exist on your page and then rearranging it in a way that just fits a little bit better. There's always a way to make it work. I know it feels impossible sometimes, but if you get a little bit creative, you think about general rules of reading left to right, up to down. We try to do that. So left to right, up to down, that means you have to start at the left side of your page, maybe a little bit higher up if you can. If I take my marker, I'm now starting at number 1. There's a blood flow here coming up, a small arrow, but I want to get to number 2. Number 2, talking about trafficking, coming around here. There's number 3. There are these little side stories here, but I'm looking for the biggest arrow, which is pulling me back on this trajectory. And then maybe if I go back and I look at the story in more detail, I'm going to kind of revisit these little arrows. But at least the general, gravitational pull is sort of this cyclical story. So really keep that in mind. Less arrows is more, and be selective about where you're adding them. And there's always a way to rearrange. It's like cleaning up your room, just put things in the right place, in the right order. Sometimes easier said than done, but I promise you, if you give it a go, try a couple of formations, you'll be able to get there. Here's a simpler example, and we've used this before as well, sort of like a protocol diagram. This is what I'm reading when I see this, and I saw this other fork down here. So not terrible, actually, but I think the placement of the text relative to the picture is inconsistent. So that also kind of confuses me a bit. And when we cleaned this one up, it was really simple. We just kind of numbered it, put it in a row, and came up with sort of a main story arc. And then there was that little fork in the road, but it was actually less important. So we kind of gave it a little offshoot, a little off ramp, and its own little story on the side instead of a fork. The fork wasn't necessary here. It was more of like there was a main story and there was sort of a little side story happening. So keep that in mind of like where you're placing emphasis and what's deserving of that much real estate and attention versus what isn't. Okay, last tip before I move on to real live figure makeover is context. This one's pretty simple. Know your audience. If your grant reviewer is likely to be more science savvy, you might not need all these extra labels like cell membrane or cytosol or nucleus. You could probably get away with maybe a smaller font here, maybe a lighter colored font, let it sort of drop into the background, almost to say that if they missed it or if they printed this sheet and it didn't show up, it's okay. You know what I mean? Like if anything, if they walk away with just understanding this process, and they're likely to know where the cytosol is, then you can knock those back, even remove it completely. Remember, we don't have a lot of real estate to work with, so be very selective about the information you're adding in. Here's another example. So talking about metastases of a tumor. First of all, these arrows are unnecessary. When I see a bunch of arrows, it usually means that there's just too many things smashed together. You can actually create more breathing room. Let me remove these. Stage 1, 2, 3, 4. Between, rows or concepts, leave enough breathing room, and that replaces the need for an arrow. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think your audience will be educated enough to be able to follow these steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. And probably don't even need to know that this is a trachea and lungs. Of course, know your audience, but if we're not teaching grade 12 anatomy or, I don't know, level 1 anatomy in university, maybe you don't need to show the shape of the lung so much. In fact, I think there's more clarity in maybe just suggesting that there's lungs there. Look how much the tumor stands out now once I've done that. Same with the liver. Most people know just the shape of the liver at that level of education. Like, the liver is a very popular shape. I think anyone on the street, if you stop them, they might be able to identify that that's a liver. So it doesn't have to be like shouting in their face, hey, this is a liver, because it was actually detracting from the story. So know your audience. They may not need to see all the background context. Even the trachea, maybe that's something we could knock back too. Let's see what happens when we do that. By the way, I'm shift selecting in BioRender, and then I'm using this transparency slider, which I think it's probably one of the favorite features, hidden features of us science designers. If I do that, look at what stands out. The lymph nodes pop, the tumor pops. Look at the difference from the before and the after. The focus is now really on those tiny little elements that were sort of hidden before. Such a stark difference. So this is, know your audience, know the context, and use arrows sparingly. And last topic on context, always put your figure into its final layout, even if it's fake. I grabbed this from Google. It has nothing to do with the figure, just a bunch of text. I suspect, and I've read in some grant requirements or specifications that you have like 3-inch by 2-inch sometimes to work with, or a small little business card size, which is very different from if you're presenting, at a conference. You have a huge screen to go to rely on. So when you shrink it down, you've lost a lot of information. Sometimes the font will be too small, the strokes will be too thin, there'll be too many elements to separate, differentiate from each other. And if you do this at the 25th hour, right before you're about to submit, it's really stressful because now you're going back in and you're trying to tweak everything to make sure it's legible. So really do it, like we're saying here, as early in the design process as possible. You've got a sketch, you think it's going to work for your grant, throw it into this fake world, this fake sort of mock-up layout, and see if it holds up, see if the design holds up. Okay. All right, so that's 4 tips: clarity over beauty, color, arrows, and context. Let's switch over, switch gears a little bit into, actually executing on these concepts. And just a quick gut check here on how we're doing for the chat. Looks good. We've got an awesome BioRender team here answering questions vigorously. Wow, lots of questions answered, over 60. So please keep them coming. We'll be answering them as we go. All right. Okay. Starting a figure from scratch. Hopefully you won't have to do this too often. I imagine a lot of you, maybe 80 to 90%, have an image in BioRender, in PowerPoint, Illustrator, on paper, you name it, that you're going to maybe want to tweak after this webinar with these new tips. If you are starting from scratch, however, I like to write it on paper, maybe import it into BioRender, sort of like this, move it to the side. You can actually upload anything into BioRender that's sort of a JPEG or a PNG by coming here to uploads, click upload, and I'll just throw in a little bio emoji here, and it shows up in my uploads section. But The point is, I like to start with the sketch because it's really the fastest thing to get, idea to paper. And then what I start doing is I start populating my canvas with these elements here. Synapse. This is sort of the fun part. Hopefully, if we have the icons you need. If we don't, we can actually make them for you. You do need a premium account, but our team is really talented, and pretty much every single icon in the library has been a result of a request from all of you. So if we're missing a really key icon, we're very happy to make sure we include it. We've got some neurotransmitters here. Back to my search results. Where are we? Here we go. Maybe an open one and a closed one. So yeah, just start populating your canvas with these icons. And this is sort of where the fun begins. This is where you start to sort of, as I said, puzzle piece together. How am I going to make this all work? Do I need to really show the brain? Like, is it necessary? Maybe not. Maybe my audience knows that this happens, between nerves, and the brain would be necessary if it was a bit more for a non-scientific audience. If you want to show maybe a before and after of the brain to show that your work is going to influence maybe, Alzheimer's disease. Something like this could be interesting. Like this is the work that you're going to be doing, and then maybe there's like a before and after image that you can, or a before and after line you can draw like that. And so, hey, my work relates to this side of the brain where, it's deteriorating. Let's put a little call out. You don't even really need a call out. I think it's pretty obvious. Like, okay, if you label this, it's going to be, related to this disease part of the brain. Anyway, that's starting from scratch. So I encourage you to sort of look through the icon library, even the template gallery. If I typed in synapse, we probably have a really beautiful template in the gallery. Oh, the difference here, icons on the left, templates on the right. These are all templates related to synapse. So maybe there's already an image here that you can use. And you can literally just plop it into your image. There we go. It comes in as a grouped icon, so it kind of looks like one icon, but it's actually just grouped. And then, yeah, you're absolutely allowed to use this for your grants and just modify it to your needs. So that's why I say, hopefully you don't have to start from scratch, but if you do, these are some good tips to keep in mind. Write it on paper and then populate your canvas with icons and sort of puzzle piece and Tetris as you need. A couple of sort of layouts that are good for grants. I would say specifically this because it's usually talking about one effort, two different outcomes. So this is a nice layout you can use, but I won't focus too much on this because you've already gone through a little bit of how it's nice to kind of stick to very consistent compositions like this one that we talked about earlier. This one is cyclical, where it's sort of a smooth transition between 1 to 4. All right, jumping into the figure makeover. Special thanks to our internal team here who helped to put these figures together, and then some brave volunteers who had submitted their diagrams to be sort of revamped here live together. If hopefully we'll get to all of them. We've populated 4, and I want to at least get to 2, but all of them are really, really great. We got hundreds of submissions, and we'll probably run more sessions like this. So please look out for more figure makeover tutorials. And the great thing is we'll be sending these folks a final version of this figure for being so brave, and you can use that for your grant image. Okay, first tip here. Actually, you know what? We had a script for this and then we threw it out because as we were going through as a design team, we realized a lot of the tips were literally in just playing devil's advocate and becoming a beginner again. Sort of akin to asking a non-scientist friend how they see your image or what they make of your image, how they read your image. But I think being a beginner is such a critical part of being a great visual communicator, really a great communicator in general. So let's dive into the first one and how we did this. Here's the before figure. Actually quite beautiful, quite simple. I wouldn't say it's too, complex. I don't think there's too many colors. So pretty decent job overall. So we didn't want to change too much about it, but there were definitely some things we could improve on. So I'll take my little marker here. One thing is, yes, the abundance of these arrows, I think, was a bit of a legibility issue for us. I think the difference in the type of diagram. So this one, these images are sort of 3D looking. These are sort of flat looking. So that kind of creates a bit of a disjointedness to it. And then I suspect at a small scale, it would be pretty hard to see. So if I were to zoom out, you'd probably lose a lot of information. Some of the text was too small, etc. So what we did was we updated this using BioRender icons. Here was our first go. So we literally just did what I did in the beginning with the neuron image, is Google's BioRender searched, T cell, neutrophil, NK cell, monocyte, populated the canvas, and rearranged the images. This was great, but we put our thinking caps on, or our devil's advocate or beginner hats, and we talked out loud as if I was a non-scientist. Literally, it sounds so silly, but here's what we said. Okay, imagine like your mother or father or aunt or uncle who might not be in the sciences comes in and says, all right, I see a mouse, it's getting injected with something, and now I see another mouse and it's getting injected with something else. Something is pointing down this way, and there's some other things happening here and here. Another thing is happening below somehow, and it's coming up and meeting them in the middle. That's literally what you want. That's what you want to hear. From that, we realized that we actually had it wrong. It isn't actually two different mice. It's the same mouse getting two different treatments. So we had to go back to the drawing board, because actually, talk about clarity over beauty, the old one was way more clear in the communication of this concept, as opposed to our sort of relatively more detailed or beautiful diagram. So I took a second stab at it, or two or three or four. Here's another version, a little better. Now I see that there is one mouse, two treatments. Maybe there's an order in which they're given. So first, second, that's great. There are these arrows pointing down, these arrows pointing up. I think we can't really get away with that too much, because there's something going on inherent in the body that's also happening at the same time. But a little bit too much of color difference. So a little more tweaks to this diagram, and this was our final version. Not huge difference between the last two, but I really wanted to stress that the before and the after are quite stark. I think we've done a good job. I think it's more successful. You can be the judge of that. But what we did was we incorporated, subtlety of arrows, reduce the amount of colors that we're using. You can see here, these almost look like really washed out colors, which is okay. Because right now my eye goes up here to the treatment. So I think that was really important to have that stand out. Even something as subtle as, look at this, see this T? It sometimes looks like arrows are crisscrossing each other as opposed to influencing three. Look at the difference between this arrow, this intersection, and this one. See this subtle curve? This was also a point of confusion. I thought, hey, maybe the humoral anti-response is cyclical with this cellular antiviral response. It actually was trying to say that the NK cell influences all three cells, but I didn't see that. This subtle curve kind of communicates that. So again, a bit of an advanced tip, but just keep in mind that arrows can speak volumes if you're not careful. And then again, what I would do is take this whole image, throw it into context, shrink it down itty bitty if it is going to be this small. And then you'll know very quickly what you can get away with, what you can't. Probably actually don't have room for these little side words. That's all you might have room for. And then you might need to do something like, A, B, C or something, and then have, I guess, a legend that communicates it a little bit more. And then I'll make my text nice and big. And then, yeah, as I said, that will be maybe clearer in the caption below. You'll see what happened there. I didn't have room for those paragraphs of text because in context, it got completely lost. That's why it's really important to put it in situ in the context while you're illustrating, while you're creating the diagram. Okay, second one. This was really fun because this was related to more of a process with a lot of machinery. This happens a lot where sometimes you'll throw in images like photos mixed with a well plate mixed with a diagram or a clip art, and you kind of get these little clip arty looking white halos and a little bit of inconsistency. I hear that feedback a lot is how do I make my image look more consistent? So of course, what we did was we scrapped it all. We replaced it with BioRender icons, almost like a fresh coat of paint. And then we actually used what's a really cool feature in BioRender, and it's this commenting feature. Not a lot of people know we have it, but getting this feedback from fresh eyes was really important, and using the comment feature really helped with that. So something like remove this with a better maybe PNG version. And then my colleagues up here who this file is shared with can actually come in and collaborate with me on this part of the diagram. So commenting, really cool feature in BioRender. I really encourage you to try it out. Also, if you click the share button, you can invite collaborators, and sort of like Google Docs. You just invite people to collaborate on your diagram. So here's the before. Here's our first stab at it. I think it was nice, but again, a little too beautiful than clear. These arrows were sort of getting lost. The background was starting to get hazy, almost like it was like muddy water. The algae was sort of like reminding me of like algae filled water, which is kind of cool. I think that was the intention, but it's a little too creative for being communicative. And another thing actually I liked that our artists called out was in the previous version, I wasn't sure what it was trying to communicate. Again, putting my devil's advocate thinking cap on of a beginner. What I see is a box with some test tubes or vials or something. There's some sort of experiment going on. Maybe they add it to these little glass plates. And then next, there's a bunch of machines that I could use as options. I don't know if it's sequential like this or if it's just three different options independent of each other. Same thing for the next row. There's sort of three different machines independent of each other. And then there are these arrows that point down to these three outcomes. But I don't know if these three outcomes are actually directly correlated to the machine above it, or whether it's correlated with all of the machines at one time. So there's a lot of confusion there around maybe the box and the placement of the arrows. Overall, I think it was almost there. So again, we gave it sort of that fresh coat of paint, as in new BioRender icons. We moved the labels on the left to be much, much larger. You can imagine that would get completely lost, these little font sizes here. So we made it nice and large. The next iterations, we removed the background because it was just too distracting. And then in the final version, we sort of used this. We went with this layout. Now this assumes that. Oh, sorry, no, that's not the final version. This is the final version. I like how they kind of cut the arrow along the way and made it look sequential. So something's happening up here, bunch of test tubes, maybe it's a bioreactor. Next step, yes, it was actually a 3-step process. I believe the original author should correct us if we got this wrong, but this was an assumption we made, was that you go to the next sort of major process, which included these 3 machines, next major process, which included these next machines. And then the application, we sort of assumed that it's, sort of independent variables, like they don't really relate to one or the other. If it did, however, you'd probably want to do something a little bit different, like something like this. See the difference there, how that changes the communication of it? So arrows, really powerful communication tool. You need to break the box there, because if it butts up against the box, it's kind of communicating that this whole box relates to the next thing. I hope I'm making sense, talking a little bit with technical language. Okay, so I think it's pretty successful. Here's the before, here's the after. And all these machines, by the way, super cool. Freeze, dryer, icons. Yeah, so it came up right away. All I do is drag and drop, resize, and then boom. I think you could select your like colors, but all saves you so much time, just the machines having been created and unified. All right, let's do one more figure together. Oh, there's so many good ones here. How do I pick? Okay, I'm gonna try to do all of them. Here's an image. I'm not gonna go into much detail, maybe for another time, but really beautiful. It's really nicely colored too. I like the general warm color palette, denoting some sort of inflammation or something going on in the body. Um, I'll very quickly show the before and after and maybe how we came to that solution. So here was the before, a bunch of iterations went by. This one we didn't like because, the forceps were kind of pointy and the poor little mouse's mouth. It was just a lot of things happening. And not necessary. You can abstract that detail. So we remove that. Here's the final version, just simply, placed in the mouth. Um, and lots were removed. So the background colors were removed. The text colors were unified. So hopefully almost every font is now black. If it's colored, it's for a very good reason, because I think this is the point of the story here. Let me just zoom in a little bit. Sorry, it might be small. Um, Again, beautiful diagram, really interesting story. So that's why we selected this image. What else did we do? We removed some things, like maybe this cluster of cells. You can put it back in if you felt like it was really important, but we really wanted to just box in each aim. Aim 1, aim 2, aim 3. We even added these little sort of like title background bars so that it stood out a little bit more. Um, Lots of little tweaks that ended up, I think, becoming more successful in the end. But really, it was removing color. I think that was the main thing here, and adding a bit of breathing room in between each box. Okay, I just zipped by that one. We also picked this one because I thought this was really interesting. This was a little bit more related to population health, or maybe you work at the crossroads of biology and sociology or social applications of science. You'll come across diagrams that have like photos and maps and icons and um, clip art, and it sometimes can get hodgepodgey. This image is beautiful because it's subdued with the color options, but I think we could give it a little bit more punch as far as clarity. One thing is, I don't know if you all knew, but this was showing a zoom in of the continent of Africa. Um, I guess we can kind of assume that too, based on this, individual. Maybe they're Black, so I'm like, okay, maybe it's like related to certain areas of the world where that's more prominent. But you can't assume that, and I think in their world it makes sense, the researchers. But what we did was we zoomed out and we added a larger area of the map just to really communicate that, yes, this is the continent of Africa that we're talking about. Maybe you could have zoomed out even further. And then, added the details of this really interesting spots of data collection. So things like that, we also made sure that there's enough contrast in between the two people here, or the people colors. And I think that was the main thing. Not a ton more to add. I think we, clustered everything to the top. Um, but again, different type of figure. I thought it was fun to kind of go through different types. Um, and yeah, that's all of the figures I wanted to show today. I'd love to go into detail more about how we came across this one. Maybe we'll do a separate video in a future webinar. All right, that was a lot of information. I hope you're able to implement some of those in your daily practice. Repeating again, we went through clarity over beauty for your grant figures, color being a very powerful tool, arrows used very sparingly, context, make sure your audience appropriate, and then lots of things in between. Thank you so much for all of your questions. That hour flew by really quickly. And thank you for joining us. We always get the question of how do you get access to BioRender Premium, because some of the features I did use are only available on the premium version. And If you're exporting for your grant, you probably want a high resolution export as well, which is available on the premium version. 3 ways you can get BioRender Premium. One, there'll be sort of a self-checkout model where I'm going to share a different screen here. Here we go. Hopefully you can see my other screen. This is a view of an incognito window of me and BioRender on a free version. I just signed up for my own free account. If this is you, this is probably what you're going to see. If I go to plans and billing, I can get a 14-day free trial. Again, no commitment to purchase. You can even downgrade after you download your high-res version if you really want. Hopefully it brings enough value to you that you like to continue on the paid version. But we know that, sometimes it could be a commitment to purchase. Another way on that note is coming back to my other slide here, is to check if your institution already has BioRender. A lot of people don't know that their institution actually purchases BioRender site-wide and you have access. Maybe your department purchased it and your department will give you free access. If your company pays for it already, your company will give you access, or maybe sell it back to you at a discount. It depends on the type of pricing model that your purchasing department selected. But there's actually a link. If my colleagues can drop a link into the, that link there, actually, that's the wrong link. That will take you to our third option, which is a request for a BioRender at your institution. If you and 20 colleagues can get together and purchase together, there's a 20-seat minimum, but you can actually purchase it for your department or start out for your school and then grow out from there. You can be the first ones to bring BioRender to your school. Let me link that out to you. Actually, if my team can post it there, it's just the department, the /department BioRender website. Yeah, that one. If you click that, it'll actually tell you, hey, type in your school, type in your department. We'll check for you if you already have access. And hopefully you can just piggyback onto that and not have to pay out of pocket. So those are the 3 ways you can get BioRender Premium. And I really hope you try it out. We work really hard to bring you a really great experience in the product, great webinars like this. And you have sort of a BioRender buddy in your back pocket all the time. We've got this little help button in the bottom right of the app. This will tell you answers to questions like, yeah, how do I cite BioRender? How do I crop an icon? If I type in crop, how do I crop an icon, shape, or object? So this is sort of like your modern day Clippy from Microsoft. It helps you. And then we have actual live professional, knowledgeable agents ready to live chat with you if you really need. Between the hours of 9 a.m., 6 p.m. Eastern, that's how you can get in touch with us and give us feedback, ask questions. You can even ask them to look for you if your institution has access, if you forget the links and all that. But love our customer experience team. They're amazing. They're there for you if you need. Okay, we are over time. Thank you so much for participating. Oh, I didn't share the results of the poll. Those of you who are still here, you get to see who was here. So lots of really great answers. 63% of you aren't currently applying for a grant. 37% of you are. That's a pretty large amount, actually. But who knows? You might use images for a future need. Lots of folks using GraphPad, and then I think if you selected other for science software, you put it in the chat. So we'll consolidate that later. And I'm really glad to see there were some people who had never used BioRender before. So welcome to the community. We can't wait to see what you create. And if you are already a power user or a light user of BioRender, we're excited that you're with us and hope to continue to get value from the application.